Welcome to everybody watching online tonight. We're glad to be with you. I'm Pastor Rita from Sherwood Park Alliance Church, and it's my privilege tonight to talk with Dr. Sean Reynolds. Dr. Reynolds, you've been a part of our church for quite a few years now. Tell us a little bit more about your life.
Yeah, so we've been in the church for about 11 or 12 years. My wife Janet and I have been married for just hit 20, and we have two daughters, one of whom just went off to university, which is interesting when you live in residence, but there's no classes to attend. So
Wow.
she's there, and the other one is just about to start grade 9. Fingers crossed. So we'll see.
Wow. Wow. Well, congratulations on two things there. Congratulations on 20 years of marriage and on a daughter off to university. So those are both milestones. That's great.
We made
That's
them both, so yeah.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Well, Lauren and I have 4 children, and we are privileged to have 3 grandchildren. So I'm very grateful for that. You brought up something there, Sean. Your daughter's off to university, and yet things look very different than they would have if she had gone to school for the first time a year ago, because the world's quite different and there's a lot of uncertainty. And the topic that we're going to talk about tonight is probably something that you're, rooting for her to have no matter what she faces. And that is the topic of resilience. And, just before we dive into that topic of what is resilience, how do we develop it? How do we become more resilient people? Just before we dive into that, I'd love to just ask you this question. On the screen tonight here, we've got a pastor and a psychologist. Just from your perspective, what do you see as the value of the two of us having a conversation on something like resilience tonight?
I think it's important for us to be aware of how these are linked in a positive way. That we see in the world, we kind of have this sense of science and religion as being two separate camps. And what we know is that God's truth comes out through science. I really see that in psychological literature, and we're going to talk about that in some of what we're going through later on tonight. But these are not areas that are at odds. They are one informs the other. And so having us both here with these different areas of expertise, I think is a really nice balance, because I will talk about things that are largely based on secular research, but there's nothing in here that's going to be inconsistent with what Jesus taught us.
Uh,
He knew all this stuff 2,000 years ago. It's amazing.
yeah, I love that. For a long time, there's just a simple saying that I love, and that is all truth is God's truth. And no matter where it's discovered or how we learn it's still God's truth. And so I love that. And I really thank you for being with us tonight for this conversation. Sean, let's just dive right into the topic. Talk a little bit about this thing, resilience. In fact, you and I were kind of laughing before because I said, is it resilience or resiliency? Because some places say resilience. And anyways, I think you said it. It's really, you can say it either way, right?
Think it can go either way, and it's as we go into this, I'll give just a little bit of a caveat to start with. So my background is I'm a psychologist. Most of my work is with kids and families. I do a lot of work in schools, and so as we're going through this, I want to be clear. We'll hopefully go through ideas and strategies, hopefully some things that are practical that you can use, but it's different from therapy or from a relationship with the mental health professionals. So we'll talk about general ideas, but keep in mind these are general ideas. There may be some things that aren't a fit for you, and that's okay. This wouldn't override anything that you're getting from a therapist that you're working with one-on-one. I'm a psychologist. I'm not your psychologist, so I just keep that in mind as we're going through this.
Awesome.
With resilience, and it seems as though we can go either way, resilience or resiliency. So I think we're on solid ground both ways. A definition of it is adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, fears, or any big source of stress that's going on. This can come from any different area. It can come from finances, relationship problems, health difficulties, challenges at work, your car breaking down, worries about COVID, worries about your kids getting COVID. It can come from a lot of different areas, but the key part is what our response is to these stressful things. We know that in the world, there are going to be stressful things. This is pretty much a guarantee. There are things that we do that can create stress, that create drama for ourselves, often in mistakes that we make. But really, a lot of things that happen to us are things that we don't have a whole lot of control over. Resiliency is the ability to manage those things and to be able to roll with the punches.
Awesome. Well, you and I, as we've talked about this a little bit, preparing for tonight's conversation, we've talked about this thing of maybe a simple way of saying it too is that it's the ability to bounce back. And I loved an illustration that you kind of gave in that regard. Just talk about that basketball illustration for a minute.
So a way of seeing this as a practical way of seeing it is compare a basketball versus an egg. So when things are going well, they're both, the basketball is round and the egg is oval, but they seem like they're functioning okay. When you bounce a basketball, it's resilient. It will bounce back 90% as high as you dribbled it down. So it will come back and come back and come back again. An egg, when you bounce it, it doesn't bounce. It just goes flat. So the resilient thing here is the basketball, that ability to bounce back. As we were preparing for this, there was a headline in the Sherwood Park News that kind of struck me because it talked about financial resiliency and the province preparing for financial resiliency. And I thought that's a nice way of thinking about it. It's different from a straightforward mental health perspective with it. When we're in a time right now where people's finances are at a lot of risk, first due to oil, secondly due to COVID, and so this has an effect, obviously, on the resources of the province and the debt that we're in right now. And it struck me that the times when things are seemingly at their worst, we know that things go in cycles a bit, and it's resiliency that allows things to go in a cycle. And so an example that I wanted to bring up was, and I'll show a picture of this, and I'll just pray that it comes up on the screen well. So this is a picture of the, people may very well recognize this. So this is the stock market going from 1950 up until about 1982. And if you see towards this part, it looks like it's just going down, down, down. Who in their right mind would invest in something like that? Because that looks like it's just going to go to zero. And the stock market at that time, I believe, was about 2,100. And now, though, if we look at the next 30 years, we can see how far it's gone up since then. So you take these valleys, and they look like times that are not at all good times to invest. And it turns out that those really are. And that's where, when we have a market that's resilient, that's what happens. When we have mental health that's resilient as well, that's what happens. When we look back on the days of our lives that did not go well, the hope is that we're in a better spot now than we were then. And if we're not, if this is truly the kind of a valley and one of the lowest places that you're at, then there are things that we'll talk about tonight that will hopefully help to bring that up so that you're at that bottom when it looks like it's not going to get better, but it actually is.
And for me, just that, it's such a hopeful word, resilience, to me, because the basketball does have to go down and hit the floor, but it does bounce back as opposed to the splat. And so I love that. I love that hopefulness of the fact that even if we are in that low ebb, that we're going to come, there's going to be things that help us come back out of it. And, we had a conversation about a month back like this, and that conversation was with regards to anxiety, like kind of our mental health and our anxiety. How are mental health and resiliency related to each other?
So these are related, and we'll put in a plug here that you can find the past one if this is a topic that speaks to you. This is on the Sherwood Park Alliance Church YouTube page. So if you Google YouTube Sherwood Park Alliance Church, our smiling faces will pop up there. Although it seems like on the screen grab, I'm doing some kind of like this, like it doesn't look as good as I would like.
It's not very flat.
Maybe I look like that all the time. I'm not sure. I'll ask my wife. So how these are related, and anxiety is such a key component to it. When our mental health is good, we don't worry so much about it. We're able to manage stress that comes up. Our mood typically doesn't get too low when things are going well. We're not anxious. We're feeling good. And so when little things pop up that bother us, they're not that big of a thing. It's when times are tougher that the resiliency is more important, because when we have resiliency, when these negative things come up, when these challenges come up, they tend to be more short term in nature. They are more likely to be things that we can manage. But if we don't have that resiliency, then we have a real struggle with it, and it becomes a bigger deal than it otherwise would. It's, if I bring it back to the financial example, when we're doing well, we worry less about what we're spending money on, and that's not a concern. But then when a surprise happens and we lose a source of income, then it's like everything is kind of up in the air. If we've got resiliency, if we have financial resiliency, then we have the nest egg that helps us to be able to manage that. And if we're not at that spot yet, then we often have more stress and distress around it.
And when I have heard sometimes people say, "Oh, so and so is just a very resilient person," and sometimes that sounds to me like, they're just born that way. But I think in this conversation, we're just also definitely wanting to provide that hope to say resilience is something that you can increase, right? Like it's not a
Absolutely.
yeah, it's not a fixed point. You and I talked in relation to this about another term, and that is growth mindset.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I know when you hear that kind of language, often it's talked about either a fixed mindset or a growth mindset. And so when we talk about resilience, the really hopeful part of this is that tonight, no matter where anyone is at who is watching, the possibility of increasing their resilience is very real. It's not for some people, and then some people are just fragile with no hope of ever getting stronger. The hope is
Hmm.
that just like if we train for a marathon, we can increase some strength.
Hmm.
Is that accurate?
Yeah, and I think the marathon example is a good that's a good metaphor for it, because some people are naturally better runners than other people are, and I think we can see that, and that kind of makes common sense to us that some people are blessed in that particular area more than others. But everyone is able to benefit by practice and by sharpening our skills, sharpening the saw on that. And so you can become stronger physically by doing things that are going to make you that are healthy choices that are going to allow you to do that. It's something it's not fixed though, and I think that's the important thing. We can all do things that bring us over into that area. The growth mindset idea was put forth more recently by Dr. Carol Dweck, who's a researcher at Stanford, and she talked about talents, the perspective that talents can be developed as opposed to talents being innate. So if I do poorly on a math test, I can make a lot of attributions as to why that is. I can say, well, I'm no good at math. So that would be an example of not a growth mindset, because I'm no good at math, and well, I'm no good at math, and that's too bad for me. Uh, but you can have other perspectives as well. I didn't study that well for that test. So you can have a perspective that will allow you to make a different choice to be impactful in what you're doing. And I think a lot of this is, I want to emphasize the importance of our own choices and our own ability to get better at this. This is not, by the way, like preparing for a marathon. This isn't something that you will be better at by 10 o'clock tonight. As
Right.
awesome as we are, this will not be enough to get you where you want to be, but it's a gradual process. And what's important is that God has given us the ability to grow and to change. And this is this is one of the ways that we're able to do this. And we'll get into some practical things later on. But that's the idea with it. One of the other terms that's similar to it is locus of control, which is more from a couple of decades ago, but it's a similar kind of thing that we can have a growth mindset, or we can be stuck. And we know that obviously growing is better than feeling stuck.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
we sometimes have situations that force this growth a little faster than we would like. If I have a daughter that's just moved out of the house, this is going to make me get ready for that, whether I want to or not. And so I have to grow in that way and be able to do and manage that.
That yeah, no, that's great. I really appreciate that because even in part of my story that I shared last time, there was a point where I was incredibly fearful and filled with anxiety, but that didn't need to be the fixed point that I stayed at. And I thank God it wasn't. And so just for anyone listening tonight, I mean, my heart here right at the beginning is for them to just hear loud and clear, there is hope. And you may be right now thinking of yourself as like, I just can't handle life and I'm not doing well in COVID. That's a good starting point to know that, but don't stay there. Like,
Mhm.
don't stay there. And I trust that as we continue the conversation, there will be some hope giving things. I there's an advertisement on the television for Scotiabank, and it says this. It says, "You're richer than you think," and probably that you all heard that. As I said it, you're like, "Oh yeah, I've heard that." But I think one of the things tonight for me, I would love to have come out loud and clear is you're stronger than you think. And with God's help, this resilience can expand. Right now you may feel like you're maybe even in the last little while, your circle of life has even shrunk. Well, I believe with God's help, that can expand. You can grow. You can become more resilient. And so I'm very grateful for that. Hey, Sean, why don't we just maybe take a turn, each tell just a quick little scenario from our lives of a time that you faced something difficult and look back and see that resilience path a
Mhm.
little.
Yeah, I was reflecting on this and trying to think of a time in my life that was a real struggle. And one of the times that was for me was when I had moved to California to work on a degree program, and I was really excited about moving there. And for a lot of reasons, the trip it didn't go well, and a lot of that it was my own maturity, my own ability to be able to manage the stress that was there. Being far away from home for the first time, there were things that I just wasn't really prepared for, and I, at the time, I don't know if it was a clinical depression, but my mood was probably lower than it had been at other times in my life. Certainly, I think the level of disappointment was really, really high there. And as a 20-year-old, my resiliency skills were not super awesome at that point. I hadn't dealt with a lot of adversity up to that point, and so I wound up moving back home eventually, kind of with my tail between my legs, and then was trying to think about uh, where I wanted to go or what I wanted to do, because now I was really stuck in terms of what am I going to do for work? What's my career looking like? I've got another 45 years of work, and what on earth is that going to be? And I wound up. I think what got me uh, out of that spot was really thinking about what do I want to do in my work or in my life, and so finding meaning. And this was through prayer around, "Oh, okay, God, I went down this path, and that path really wasn't the right one. What should my path be?" And that wound up leading me into psychology. I think in retrospect, if I'd gone into psychology right off the bat, I wouldn't have been mature enough to be successful with it anyway. So it was the scenic path to getting there, but that search for meaning, I think, was really what made a difference and pulled me out of that, gave me some more direction. And that's something that God will provide for us, sometimes in a super clear way, and sometimes not. For me, it certainly was not. I was looking for the letter in the mail, and it never came. But it was a process of figuring out what am I meant to do, or what's my calling. And as I worked through that, it kind of became apparent as to what that was. And then I saw things afterwards in my life where it's like, oh, that's why this thing was so hard, because it was preparing me for that. There were kind of signposts along the way that I didn't see at the time. And again, it's this idea of when we think about, when we look at our life in terms of the stock market, that it's in these spots where the greatest growth tends to occur, at the bottoms. And but it's really hard to see that when we're right in the bottom. That's when we're most likely to feel depressed, least likely to be able to manage stress that's coming up. There was a sign on outside of one of the high schools that I work at, and it was really cool. It said, "You've survived the 10 worst days of your life so far. You're doing great." And I thought, well, that's pretty neat, because in fact, all of us watching this right now have survived the 10 worst days of our lives, whatever those are. And so we have some resiliency, whether we know it or not.
Yeah, I appreciate that because we need that perspective from others, right? That hey, you know what? Actually, you might be doing better than you think you are.
Mhm.
Um, For me, Sean, that's definitely true. This was definitely one of the worst 10 days of my life for sure. That came to mind. And that was shortly after Lauren and I were married. We'd been married for about a year, and I was 22, I guess, at the time. Um, we had a pretty tragic and very unforeseen thing happened at that time, and so this is some years back, so it's easier to talk about now. But what happened was that my sister and brother-in-law were both killed in a car accident, and they were actually on their way to visit us. They were on their way to have lunch with us, and they were both killed in a car accident. So that was incredibly traumatic. That was an incredibly difficult time. The additional piece to that is that my sister had just given birth to a 10-week premature, so born at 30 weeks, precious little daughter who was in neonatal. And so, kind of in one day, I lost my sister and my best friend, and Lauren and I became parents, because we had already had that conversation with my sister and brother-in-law that they said, would you be guardians of our little tiny baby should something happen, which was God's grace too in advance. But so that obviously is one of those massive traumatic times in life. And like you, I was very young. I would say, looking back, that there were two things that really helped us. I cannot say I bounced back. I think, it was a slow, but there's two things specifically. Number one was we both had a deep, deep trust in God. And that was the fact that, okay, something here has happened that is tragic. It turned our worlds upside down. It changed the trajectory of our lives, truly. But that it didn't take God by surprise, and that He was with us in the pain, that He wept with us, and yet He was still in control. So, firstly, that God was there, but secondly, the community around us. Like, as I look back, I honestly, I think I would have been the egg, maybe, like if it hadn't been that there were so many people, both our church community, neighbors, support, just a huge support system that came around us in every way. And they not only helped us and supported us, they also believed in us, because becoming instant parents to me felt like, I don't know that I have the resilience or like the ability to do this. But they believed in us. And that community for me was just huge in that time. And I know we're going to come back to that a little bit more later. But as I look at that and I see, that going through that experience, like I said, I wouldn't call it bouncing back, but God definitely carried us through. And we definitely became stronger people through all of it. So yeah, and we all have, from minor to major, things happen in our lives. And I know you and I were saying, this COVID time, like I think there's times where we feel like, oh my goodness, like I'm okay. I have food to eat. I should be nothing but thankful. And yet there's also this level of anxiety and uncertainty and all of these things, right, that we're all facing. And it's almost like we're all in a marathon together that we don't see the end of,
Mhm,
right?
mhm,
And we can get really tired, and we can we can wonder, like, can I keep bouncing?
mhm,
Can I keep bouncing here? Because it's not like that tragedy that's kind of happens and then you figure out life after it.
mhm,
Like, you figure out, okay, now there's a new chapter because of the tragedy. We're in this season together where we've got to learn to be resilient, and we've got to help our kids be resilient in the midst of the ongoing uncertainty and the ongoing kind of questions about the future. So, yeah.
and those
uh,
things where it's ongoing and where there's not a specific end, I think are things that we really struggle with. My mom had a saying of, I can sit on a hot stove if I know how long I have to sit there for.
okay.
And we can, I can tolerate wearing a mask for, okay, till the end of September, fine, I can do that. But I don't know if it'll be the end of September or the end of November, or I don't know when that will be. I'm hopeful that it will not be as long as it could be, but also aware that I sure don't know what that day is. And and you see things as well that really I think dent our armor a bit, where we're beginning to see differences with how people are interpreting COVID, and that's a whole different conversation around the severity that people will see with it. But you have people on both sides of seeing it as not serious at all, and then people that are very concerned about going outside of the house and everything in between. And I think there's that risk of us not giving each other grace and not appreciating that everyone's doing the best they can, even if other people we think are not interpreting things in the right way. And that's hard for me to give, because I see people on the ends of the spectrum and I get frustrated with that. But everyone's trying our best, and I think
Right.
the stress that's involved with this, we talked a lot about this last time, but it's because it's an ongoing stressor. So it's really different from those wham big events that happen, because it's ongoing. It's this, people are wearing down with COVID, and oh, I'm just sort of done with it. I'm tired of it. But COVID apparently is not yet tired of us, and so our own perspective. We still have to keep on doing things that are going to protect other people with it. So it's so it's a challenge, and I think with your example that you shared, Rita, I think what resonates for me is that you had made deposits into your resiliency bank that you didn't realize at that young age, that you had relationships that were built that allowed you to be able to process this with friends and people that loved you, and you had a faith that allowed you to make a little bit of sense of it. Not that it was your plan or something that seemed to make sense at that time, but more that it gave you something that kind of grounded you and gave you a greater purpose in life. So I think I think both of these are things that we know are protective factors. These are things that help us out. And again, both of those are things that you can't get tonight. Those are things that we have to foster.
Yeah. But hopefully there may be some nugget that for each person watching is like, you know what, that is one I could begin to invest in. And that's something that strikes me about COVID, is that there are some people definitely that because of COVID are in an absolutely like bottom of the chart place. They've either lost jobs or they've, and very, very difficult. For many of us, it's the uncertainty and it's the ongoing nature of it. And I think more than ever right now, investing in things that help us become resilient is so important. Because like you pointed out, like those things have to be investments that you make ahead of time. And we can all right now be investing in whatever the future holds. God knows, but just in a few days here, there's some pretty big uncertainties that people are facing, and that is kids going back to school, teachers going back to work. You're involved in that system. You and your wife both work within the school system some, and I think there's a lot of angst there, isn't there?
Oh, for sure. And it's uh, again, different parents have different perspectives, and the way that we've really tried to address this as a school division is that we're going to respect what parents say. It Our opinion doesn't really matter so much because we don't know their life experience. We don't know of the grandparent that lives in the house that's medically compromised. We don't know how the child will respond to wearing a mask. There are a lot of things that we don't know, so we're just going to kind of meet parents where they're at. But having anxiety about it, having anxiety about making the wrong choice that's a really fair thing. Good news that I've learned, and I've learned this is more as daddy than Dr. Reynolds, is that you can mess up a lot as a parent, and kids are a lot more resilient than we think they are. And I'm so glad for that, because I mess up so much. And so kids have this natural ability to be able to bounce back. And we'll talk some more in a bit about how we foster that, but knowing that what's going on for kids now, we can set them up to where this is not a life-defining tragedy, but more of a speed bump or an annoyance or a way to, even build some strange memories out of.
Yeah, and yeah, we'll come back pretty quick to looking at kids specifically and parents. But why don't we dive in first and just talk about we've alluded to some of them already, but just what are some skills? And if you're watching and you're a note taker, this is probably the piece where it's like, okay, we're gonna actually give some pretty specific skills that you can invest in, and you can help those that you love invest in to help prepare you so that you will be resilient as things happen in life, and that can help you if you are right now at the bottom of one of those uh, times that are very, very difficult. So what are some of the specifics?
Yeah, and we'll put in links to these on. Now I'm going to cross my fingers because I'm jumping into a tech world that I don't really know well enough. I'm confident I can add a link on Facebook. I'm about 80% confident I can do that. But there are smarter people than me in the church that I'm hoping can make that up to 100%, and some links on YouTube as well where you can see these out there too. So if you don't have a pencil and paper around, that's okay. We'll provide some of that. Uh,
Great.
you can look on the web for ways to develop resiliency. This is what I did. I kind of had them in my brain, but I wanted to make sure that I was going on the right track. And so there's really a lot of overlap with them. I found a really nice solid list from the American Psychological Association where they have a paper that's designed for giving these practical strategies and this advice. And as I was going through it, I was really struck with the things that we'll talk about, which are so consistent with what the church does, the Sherwood Park Alliance Church does, but what the bigger church does as well. And it's again, the strategies that we use to develop resiliency are ones, they're scripturally based. There's nothing in here that doesn't match up with what we were taught 2,000 years ago. The first one that they have is build your connections, and then they had a couple of bullet points underneath that, and it was prioritize relationships and join a group. I'm like, well, that's like every other sermon that every other time we're at church, watching church, these are things that get discussed. And so why are these things important? And they're important because we're valuing people, but we're valuing relationships. When we are connected with others, then we're able to help them in times that they have trouble, and they're able to help us when we're struggling as well. Something in research, and I remember this from grad school, is that when you help a stranger, your liking of that stranger actually goes up, which sounds counterintuitive because they've inconvenienced you. If you pull over to help someone out that has a flat tire, you wind up tending to like that person more than someone that you haven't met. And you think it would not be that way, but there's something about relationship and something about helping other people that is that fosters resiliency, because it's a positive cycle. We have a lot of cycles that we think of where things get worse and worse and worse. This is one of them where it gets better and better and better. We don't have a finite amount of love or like that we can give to other people. That seems to be limitless. And so the practical takeaway from that was joining a group. And certainly within the church, this is something that's long been an emphasis of joining a small group, making those connections inside the services with people that are there. So this is one of the ways. How have you seen this, Rita, with people as they join and they make these connections? What are just the kinds of things that you see happening?
Yeah, well, interesting. There can be a real fear, and that's absolutely fair. But there can be a real fear, like, will I be accepted? Will I fit in? Will they want me in their group? Those are very real. And some people are more extroverted, some people are more introverted. So yeah, like there's some real, potential roadblocks. But my encouragement would be, don't let those stop you, because like you pointed out, from my example, if we hadn't had all of those previously built relationships, it would have been much harder to go through that circumstance.
Mhm.
And so what I have seen is I've seen people take that tentative step. I've seen them, people have told me they've come to something that's maybe it's a group at at the church or in someone's home. They said, I literally sat out in my car for a while because I was just like nervous to do it. But then you ask them later, like 3 months down the road, and they're like, I am so glad I began to invest in this. And, I also help with a ministry at the church called the Care Ministry. And we always say the best way for people to be cared for is when they're in a group of some kind where they already know each other. And then, the diagnosis comes or the tragedy comes or the failure comes. And there's a support already there. And that's so powerful. I think back in scripture just to the fact that we're created in the image of God, who is a community. It's Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, right? So there's community there just in our very DNA. And so in scripture, when you go back to Genesis, the very first thing that God says is not good. It's not when man fell. The first thing that he said wasn't good was, it's not good for man to be alone. And so proactively taking those steps and courageously stepping into community. And you know what? I can't promise you, nobody can, that it's gonna work. It might take a couple of tries. You might try a group that really doesn't work for you. Or unfortunately, there are times where you might try a group and it actually doesn't end up being a safe group. And I wish we could promise that it always would be. But 90% of the time, people have a great experience and are so glad they got connected.
And
So,
it's these relationships, just the importance of having them in different ways, in small groups, in one-on-one conversations, whether it's at work, with your next door neighbor, with people that live in another country. As long as you have this in some way, the more ways that you have it in that where you're with people that you really trust, that you're able to talk about concerns with, that seems to be the factor that really makes a difference.
yes, yes. Yes. Well, the next one on that list. So we have that connection or that support system, that investing in connections. What's
Mhm.
the next one?
So fostering wellness in terms of, and this is the physical part and the mental part of ourselves. So the physical part is taking care of the body, and so this is, again, there's a scriptural basis for this as well. But when we're in good shape, when we're doing things that we're making healthy choices, this allows us to be more resilient, and it also allows us to do things that, when I have the double brownie sundae, I can get away with that if I don't do that every day. If I'm doing things that are otherwise healthy, then I don't have to be perfect with that. Certainly, I want to make sure we hit on the idea here too of perfection. That seeking of perfection generally doesn't help,
Yeah.
because you ain't going to get it,
Yeah.
and if you're expecting to get it, you're bound to be disappointed. And so doing reasonably well, turning things over to God, but giving yourself some slack, and cutting the people around you some slack too, is such an important piece with that.
I love following some of the recent, just I love following different podcasts and different doctors and wellness things. And I love a movement that I've been seeing exactly towards what you were talking about. In fact, there's one doctor, Dr. Chatterjee in England. I really like his podcast, but he really encourages people. I think he has a book, I forget what it's called, but it's something about how to be healthy in 5-minute segments. It's like, okay, you know what? You do not need to buy a gym membership. You do not, like he's like, no, you've got some cans of beans in the cupboard. And while you're waiting for your tea water or to boil or your coffee to percolate, like use those 5 minutes and do some weightlifting with your 2 cans of beans. Like he's just so practical. And I think sometimes we make health and healthiness so complicated, or we think it's got to be expensive, or it's got to mean that you get the certain clothes and the certain all of that. And that's not the point. The point is that God has given us a body. We're stewards of it. And we can actually invest in that health through the simple things of sleep, movement, relaxation, having something that is akin to a Sabbath where we actually take a break. And that those kinds of things don't have to be complicated, but they make a big difference. Make a
It,
big difference.
well, and you're kind of hitting on the mental piece of this, where we uh, the strategy, the specific strategy they talk about is practice mindfulness. And when I hear mindfulness, it kind of makes new age bells kind of ding in my head. And the term is one that we hear a lot in psychology that I have to be careful with it, because I know there are pieces of it that are really, really helpful. And there's a part of it that makes me think, oh, that's kind of ooey gooey. But I think what is important for us is knowing that mindfulness can come in a lot of ways that is again spiritually based, that it's not something that we're trying to achieve a different state of mind. It's being aware of ourselves, being aware of what's going on around us, and just being kind of centered and being in tune with our bodies. So simple things like taking deep breaths. We have lots of instances where Jesus was crowded by people who seemed to really like him. They wanted to hear what he had to say. He was really popular, and he would uh, put in these times in his days where he would physically remove himself from other people. And so in doing this, I think this is where the idea of prayer, meditation comes in. That's a healthy strategy. And my from psychological literature perspective, there are benefits that seem to come from whether it's meditation, yoga, these things where you're centering yourself. We at least see empirically some benefits from that. I think what it is that when we're given things to do like prayer, like just being calm, thinking about God, they're going to have the same kind of impact on us in a way that speaks to us as Christians.
Yeah, and I love that you brought that up, because I do think that is an area that gets misunderstood quite often. And we can throw out the baby with the bathwater, because
Mhm.
yes, we can open ourselves up to things that we don't want to, and that we don't believe that that's the direction that we should go as Christians. But there are many times in, especially the Psalms, where it talks about meditating on God, meditating on His Word, meditating on His creation. And I kind of look at it as, this isn't an emptying of ourselves so that there's a nothingness. This is an quieting ourselves so that we can actually allow God's peace and presence to be felt. He's there with us, but sometimes we're so scattered and our minds are so noisy and we're not present to Him. And so for me, that act of mindfulness or meditation is becoming present to God's gracious presence with us,
Mhm.
and becoming present to His truth, becoming present to, and and as you talk too about mindfulness of just pausing. I was talking to someone today, and actually they're going through an incredibly dark valley right now. And they said, what I've been focusing on each day to get up and to say, this is the day the Lord has made. And that's to me mindfulness. That's stopping and saying, you know what, yesterday has some things that are difficult, and tomorrow there's some things I don't know how we're gonna navigate them, but today, right now, in this moment, I'm gonna choose to remind myself, this is the day the Lord has made. I will rejoice, and I will choose right now in this moment to remember He's with me and I'm going to be present. So I think we can get stuck in the bread on either side in the
Mhm.
sandwich, right? Like the past with some of its, regrets or things, or the future and some of the worries. And instead, God has that invitation where Jesus says, consider the birds of the air. Like I look after them. I'm with you today. And that doesn't negate planning and all of those things, but it just means that we take time to stop and to, like David said, I have stilled and quieted my soul. So I think it's a very, very, very much a biblical thing for us to do within parameters.
Mhm. One strategy that I've used personally that's been helpful, and this when I had more time because I lost a lot of my work in schools once COVID hit, was taking taking a prayer walk. And so I suspect that I'm not the only person listening to this that struggles a bit with prayer and is really working on this. And my idea was I'm going to take a short walk, and there's a little path that I have in our neighborhood. I'm going to go 5 minutes. I'm going to see if I can pray for 5 minutes. And I hit this about 60% of the time. I'm marginally successful, getting better at it. But in doing this, I'm just focusing my mind away from worries. I've got 23 hours and 55 minutes to worry about those things. I'm going to spend 5 minutes to really focus on God. And in doing that, because my mind does wander, I can wander it at least in the right direction. So I can focus on looking at the how the tree is blossoming, listening to birds, noticing smells that are coming in, what I hear with the wind, being able to notice these kinds of things. So that's again a secular strategy of noticing, being aware of your senses, but I think we can merge it in with our own spiritual life and our prayer life. That
Absolutely. Absolutely. Once again, yeah, once again, I fully believe God's truth. So we've covered connection being hugely important. And then just that whole area of wellness, of our physical wellness, and doing kinds of things that do really improve our mental well-being. What would be another one?
So finding purpose in our lives, I think, is a really big one. This allows us, when we have a bigger purpose, to we know that things are going to come in that are going to interfere with that. But if I have if I have a grander purpose, then this gives me a, a kind of a not a finish line, but a direction that I'm moving towards. And so it goes along with that growth mindset of being proactive. What can I do about the situation, as opposed to this is terrible? We all have the tendency to be able to throw ourselves a pity party, and I can do this as well as anybody else. Doing that for a few minutes isn't a bad thing. Getting stuck there for days or weeks is. And so when we have developed a purpose of what our some people like doing this as practically as making a mission statement. Some people find that to be a little ooey gooey and they're not comfortable with that. But knowing what their greater good is or what their calling is makes a difference. And you can foster this in a gradual way. Setting goals is a nice way to do this. In doing that, you want to make the goals really specific, practical, things that you can. So a goal of be a better person. I have that goal, but I don't really know how to accomplish this. So I can think of what are some specific ways that I can be a better person. I can specifically go out of my way to help 3 people today. I can make sure that I am friendly with the cashier when I go to the grocery store next time. There's some specific things that you can add in with that, and giving yourself some opportunities to try different things. I think having an openness to uh, new things in your life is a piece of that too. As we do that, we're giving ourselves variety, and you sometimes find new purposes as you're working on these kinds of things.
And again, with that one, Sean, I find it so aligns with scripture,
Mhm.
that God has given us all purpose, and that our days on earth it doesn't have to be that we just kind of twiddle our thumbs and wonder why we're here. He said, love God and love each other. Well, I find that a pretty full-time purpose right there. That
I
I
need to make it more
haven't
practical, but yeah.
yeah, I haven't mastered those. Yeah, like you said, you got to make them practical. How am I going to do that? How am I going to do that? But yeah, that thing of purpose, yeah, that resonates just so deeply with me. And when you come up against tragedy, you tell me if I'm on the right track here, just from your perspective. But when you come up against tragedy and really life maybe is falling apart, like you take the example that I gave earlier from my own story some years back, where really things were, falling apart, or maybe it's someone that's got a really tough diagnosis or something else that really is life like changing in a significant way. To be able to get up in the morning and say, what, there are still, I can't control, there's lots I can't control, but there are some things what can I control, instead of focusing on, oh my goodness, everything is out of control, which makes me, feel extremely vulnerable and fragile. But if I can instead say, what can I control? And maybe right now, all I can do is think about, you know what, one thing I could do today, one thing I could accomplish positively today is that really helps
Yeah.
uh, get us through and helps us become more resilient.
And I want to close with spending some time talking about how we foster this in our kids as well. But an example that popped into my head as you're describing this is a lot of kids, if you give them a math assignment and it's 10 pages of problems, they'll look at this and they'll, I can't do that. So we break it into smaller things that they can do. And for some kids, this will be 2 pages. For some kids, it's 3 problems. Everyone's is different. But when you are accomplishing things, it's kind of how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time?
Yeah.
It's we want to come up with things where we feel effective, where we're doing something, and everyone can do something. It doesn't have to be huge, but having something each day that we're looking towards. I wanted as well just to make sure we snuck in because we talked about how examples of resiliency in scripture, and I think Paul was maybe the best example of this, of uh, him, and he goes through his litany of I've been shipwrecked, I've been beaten, all these horrible things that have happened to him. And he continued on because he had a bigger purpose. He had a reason for what he was doing, even though he knew that that reason would expose him to hardship and things that he didn't really like very much.
Yeah, that's a great illustration from scripture of somebody that, sometimes when I'm reading some of scripture, like say a book like Philippians, which, you think if you're going to think of any book in the Bible that's, really about joy, you think
Mhm.
Philippians, like there's so much joy in there. And yet you realize he wrote that from prison.
Yep.
Wow, like there's a deep resilience there, and I totally resonate with what you're saying. You read over and over that he was so clear on what he was about, and
Mhm.
his circumstances, his own comfort, kind of the things that were happening around him, they didn't dictate to him. He knew his own purpose from God. And he said, you know what, I'm pressing on to the prize for this high calling that God has given me. And he had a purpose. Yeah. Hey,
And he
Sean.
didn't get that purpose, even though we think of that, the where he was blinded and then he was able to see again, but he didn't immediately get there. He spent some time thinking about what he needed to do, and it wasn't an immediate process for him. There's not a lot in there about the details of what happened, but it wasn't like he just this was immediate. It took him some time, I think, to develop that.
Yes, yes. There's some there's some real value in that short-term goal. Like there is purpose in today. I can find something meaningful in today. And yet, like your illustration from in your younger years of it took some time to figure out kind of that bigger purpose and
Mhm.
how God created you. Hey, Sean, in our last few minutes, I'd love to go back to what you just talked about, and that is some things. Is there anything else you would say to parents tonight? We are heading into school, being back in a few days here. Parents, grandparents, those that relate to kids, just regarding helping them with resilience.
And I think that this is really tough because we have kids that are scared to go back to school, and we have parents that are scared to send them back to school, and parents who are wondering if they're making the right choice with keeping their kids at home because they're scared not of them getting COVID at school, but scared of what's their personal development going to be. Are they going to get behind academically? There's fears that go in a lot of different ways. I think a big piece of this is modeling this effectively for our kids. So showing them, not pretending that we're not afraid or that we're not concerned about what's going on, because we're all concerned about what's going on, but doing this in a way that's age appropriate, that they can understand, but lets them know that this is a situation that nobody is really thrilled about, but here's how we're going to manage it, and here's how we're going to make the best of what we've got. So I think that's important. Knowing that our kids are going to make mistakes and that we're going to make mistakes too, that we are it's resiliency isn't an absence of errors. It's being able to bounce back from the mistakes that we make and the bad things that happen to us, and to be able to make something better out of it. And so being able to just, when we make our mistakes, own them with our kids, say, I'm not perfect and you're not either, and we're going to do the best we can. People are really on edge. There's a lot of, we've been with our families for months now, and it's most of us enjoy being with our families, but a lot of us have been with our families an awful lot, and so there's that tension that goes in with that. Um, uh, for those people that didn't get a break this summer, or that were struggling, whether again financially or socially this summer, that makes it really tough. And so having these kinds of strategies that you're using with your kids, ways that you can build their connections that are different from what you would like, but still the best that you can do in the current situation. Ways that you can foster that wellness. So the strategies that work for grown-ups really work for kids too. But I think this being able to manage stress in a safe, effective way is the best thing that we can show for our kids, and uh, we do that through our physical health, we do it through our mental health, and we do it through our spiritual life. So all of these are areas that'll help. This is an area that we could unpack, and we could spend an hour and a half just talking about that all on its own. But
Right.
the strategies that work for adults, they work for kids too.
Yeah. Sean, there was one of them that I think we talked about this with anxiety as well, but just you mentioned, and I thought it was really helpful for adults and kids. And that is just when we think of healthy thinking, just being careful to right size situations. And actually it can be helpful to grade the situation, like on a scale of 1 to 10. If 10 is the worst possible thing that could ever happen, like how big of a thing is it that we're facing, and to together, maybe as a family, with your kids, talk about that. I know that's been helpful for me. I have one friend that's really good at saying, I had to just right size this. She said, like I was so like, and I was anxious and I was all this, and then I had to right size this. And I love that language, right size this. And it just occurred to me that you had shared that strategy with me as well. And I think that's a really valuable one, even as families.
Yeah, that idea of appreciating the size of the problem, I think, is so important. So I was today I had to buy a new printer, and this was really annoying. And I went to Costco; they didn't have the one I needed, so I had to go to another Costco. And this was a real hassle. But when I think about how big of a problem is this really, it's really not that big of a problem. It's an annoyance, but it's not really that much of a problem. We tend to see problems as an 8 out of 10 that are really more like a 2 out of 10. I was organizing my space before our meeting, and I've moved the camera around so that you can't see just the utter chaos that's going on in this room. But there's an area that I felt like, oh, I need to clean this out before I do it. I didn't know if I wanted to. Well, it took me about 30 seconds. It really was not
Yeah.
that big of a thing. And I found this too with things that get spilled in the kitchen, that I can have a blah kind of reaction. And then when I time how long it takes to clean it up, it's never more than 5 minutes. It's usually about 30 seconds. And so
Yeah.
I can react to that and make it into a huge deal for me and for my kids, or I can appreciate that, over the span of a week, I'm going to make 5 messes in the kitchen, maybe 10 or 20. I'm going to make a lot of messes in the kitchen, but these are all solvable problems. As long as the oven doesn't blow up, I can manage just about anything else that happens.
Yeah, awesome, awesome. Well, hey, our time is drawing to a close here, but thank you so much. The words of Jesus where he said, in this world you will have trouble, for me is one of the starting places of resiliency. And that is just, what? It's common to the human condition. Like, we are going to have struggles didn't begin with COVID. We all have had various struggles, and we will face various struggles in the future. And together, right now, we're facing one called COVID. And Jesus said, though, you know what? Be of good cheer, because I have overcome the world. I am with you. I will never leave you or forsake you. And I'm so grateful for that. And I'm so grateful in this time. And you referred to it several times throughout the broadcast. I'm so grateful that one of the things I see happening is we are stopping to say, we need to be more gracious to each other. We need to stop and take time to say, you know what, maybe they're not doing well today. Maybe this is a bad day for them. Or maybe they have a different perspective than I do on the situation. But I can extend grace to them, just like I would like grace extended to me. And as we all seek to just help each other, to help one another when you're down, maybe it's a day I can pick you up, and help each other with this thing called resiliency, and remind each other, with God's help, you're stronger than you think. And I'm so thankful for that. Thank you so much for being with us. This has been good to be together. If you're in the proximity of Sherwood Park Alliance Church and you're not part of a small group, or you don't have a connected network, we would love to help you with that. If you have a prayer request tonight, and you would like to have some people praying with you about that situation, please go ahead and go to our website. There's a place there you can submit prayer requests and where you can connect with us. And we would love to do that. If you're watching from somewhere else, we just encourage you in those things as well. Find a caring Christian community that you can just find a place to find that support and to continue growing as we all work with God's help at becoming more resilient. Thank you for being with us tonight.